A poor black man stood at the front door of a white landowner's farm, wearing the best clothes he owned and carrying nothing else. Every neighbor who saw him walk up that road was certain of one thing. He would be turned away before he ever finished his first sentence. But after a long silence, Richard Carter looked the young man over and said, in a voice calm enough to stop the world, "My daughter needs a good man, not a rich one. Not a rich one." The crowd expected relief. What came next was something no one had prepared for, where every story begins with a father and ends with a choice that changes everything. If stories about quiet strength, character, and doing right by people are the reason you're here, you already know what to do. Stay until the end, because this one earns it. The road that led to Richard Carter's farm was not a long one, but Marcus Williams had walked it slowly that morning, taking each step like a man who understood he might not be walking back the same way. The sun was still low, the air thick with the particular stillness of a southern morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Marcus wore his good shirt, the dark one with the clean collar, pressed the night before with an iron he had borrowed from his landlady without telling her why. His boots were polished as far as the leather would allow. He carried nothing in his hands, because there was nothing he owned that would have helped him that morning. It was the turn of the century in the American South, and a black man walking toward a white man's front door to ask for something was already a statement. The year sat somewhere between the old world and the one that had not yet arrived, and in that gap, a man's worth was still measured by the color of his skin before anything else was considered. Marcus knew this. He had known it since he was old enough to read the way rooms went quiet when he entered them. But knowing something and letting it stop you were two different things, and Marcus Williams had never been good at stopping. He had been working farms in this county for more than 10 years, moving from one season to the next, hired for planting and harvest and anything in between that required a strong back and someone who showed up when he said he would. He did not own land. He did not own much of anything. But the men who had employed him over the years tended to keep his name in mind when the next season came. And that quiet kind of reputation was the only currency he had ever managed to save. Richard Carter's farm was one of the larger ones in the county, though not the largest. Richard was known for paying fair wages to every man who worked his land, regardless of what those men looked like, and that distinction made him either respected or disliked, depending on who was doing the talking. Marcus had worked a single harvest there 3 years prior and had never exchanged more than a dozen words with Richard directly. But he had watched the man, the way Richard corrected a worker without humiliating him, the way he settled a dispute between two hired hands over wages by going back to his own records and admitting when his foreman had made a mistake. These were small things, but Marcus had learned to pay attention to small things, because small things were what a man was actually made of. Before he ever reached the Carter house that morning, Marcus passed an old man named Eli, sitting on a fence post mending a harness. Eli had known Marcus since he was a boy hired out for his first harvest, and he looked up as Marcus walked by in his good shirt. "You going somewhere important?" Eli said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "You going to see Carter?" Marcus didn't answer, but his silence answered for him. Eli set down the harness in his lap and looked at him for a long moment. The way old men look at younger ones when they already know how the story ends or think they do. "Boy," Eli said, "you know what people are going to say about this. Whatever he says today, don't matter what's in his heart. There's men in this county who'll make you pay for it regardless. I know that. Then why you walking up there with that look on your face like the world's going to be fair to you?" Marcus shifted the weight on his feet. "Because somebody's got to walk up that road first, Eli. Might as well be a man who's not afraid of the answer." Eli shook his head slowly. Not in disagreement, but in something closer to recognition. The look of a man watching someone do a thing he himself had never had the nerve to do. He didn't try to stop him again. He just watched Marcus go and went back to his harness with hands that were a little less steady than before. Emily Carter was the reason Marcus was walking that road with polished boots and a borrowed iron's worth of dignity. She was 25 years old, the only child Richard had raised alone after her mother passed, when Emily was still young enough that she barely remembered a life before she had taken on half the responsibilities of the house herself. She was not the kind of woman who waited to be asked before she had an opinion, and she had never once, in all the time Marcus had known her, treated him like someone who needed to be managed or pitied. That alone had set her apart from nearly everyone else in the county. They had come to know each other slowly, the way two people do when circumstance keeps placing them in the same spaces without ceremony. A broken fence after a storm that both of them had showed up to fix at the same time. A moment at the feed store when she had noticed him trying to calculate a price in his head and had quietly said the number before he had to ask anyone for help. Small moments, unremarkable on their own, that had accumulated over 2 years into something neither of them had planned and neither of them could honestly say they regretted. There had been one evening, the autumn before, when the accumulation of those small moments had nearly become something spoken aloud. Marcus had stayed late finishing a job on the property line, and Emily had walked out to bring him water before the light went entirely. They had stood at the fence in the half-dark, neither one in any hurry to go back inside. "You ever think about what people would say?" Emily had asked him. "If they knew how much time we spend talking about nothing in particular?" "I expect they'd say plenty." "Does that frighten you?" Marcus had considered the question honestly before answering, because that was the only way he knew how to answer anything. "Not as much as it probably should. What frightens me is wanting something I have no right to ask for." Emily had looked at him for a long moment in that fading light. "Maybe asking isn't about the right to it," she said. "Maybe it's about whether you mean it." Neither of them had said anything more plainly than that. They did not need to. Some things do not require naming to be understood. But Marcus had carried that exchange with him through the winter and into the spring, turning it over the way a man turns over a coin he isn't sure he's allowed to spend. Marcus knocked on the front door of the Carter farmhouse at 7:15 in the morning, and Richard answered it himself. He was a broad man, somewhere past 50, with the kind of face that had earned its lines through weather and work rather than worry. He looked at Marcus with an expression that gave nothing away. Not surprise, not welcome, not warning. He simply looked the way a man looks at something he intends to take seriously. "Mr. Carter," Marcus said, "I'd like to speak with you if you have the time." Richard stepped back from the door and gestured for him to come inside. The front room of the Carter house was plain and well kept, the furniture old, but cared for. Richard poured 2 cups of water from a pitcher on the table and set one in front of Marcus without being asked. Then he sat down across from him and waited. Marcus had rehearsed what he wanted to say. He had rehearsed it walking along the road, and before that lying in bed the night before, and before that on the 3 evenings prior, when he had almost talked himself out of coming at all. But when he sat across from Richard Carter in that quiet room, the rehearsed words felt too careful, too constructed for a man who had built his entire life on being straightforward. So he said it plainly. "I'd like to ask for your permission to marry Emily. I know what I am and what I'm not. I don't have land or money or anything a father would hope for in a man coming to his door. What I have is a willingness to work every day of my life for her, and a promise I will not break. I understand if that's not enough for you, but I needed to ask." Richard did not respond right away. He looked at Marcus the way he had looked at him at the door, as though taking inventory of something that mattered. Outside, a rooster called out from somewhere near the barn, and somewhere farther down the road, a wagon passed. The morning continued around them without caring what happened in that room. When Richard finally spoke, his voice carried no anger and no mockery. It carried something more unsettling than either of those things. It carried the weight of a man who had already been thinking about this longer than Marcus realized. "My daughter needs a good man," Richard said, "not a rich one." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, but before it could settle into relief, Richard continued. "The trouble is, any man can say he's good. I've heard plenty of them say it. What I've never been able to do is make a man prove it in a room. Character doesn't show itself when everything is fine. It shows itself when there's nothing to gain." Richard set down his cup and looked at Marcus directly. There's a young farmer about 12 miles east of here. His name is Thomas Hale. His father died earlier this year and left him a piece of land he doesn't know how to manage. His wife is expecting their first child, and she hasn't been well. He's heading into winter with sick livestock, bad soil, and no experience. Another season like this one, and he loses everything. Marcus listened without interrupting. "I want you to go there," Richard said. "Stay as long as it takes to help that farm get back on its feet. You don't take any pay for your time. You don't come back here expecting anything in return. I'm not making you a promise about Emily. I'm not telling you that if you do this, you get what you came here for. What I'm telling you is that this is the only way I have of knowing what I need to know." The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. Marcus understood exactly what was being offered and what was not. He understood that Richard could still say no after all of it, that the test had no guaranteed outcome, only a guaranteed cost. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Carter?" Marcus said. Richard nodded once. "If I do everything you ask, and you still say no at the end of it, will you tell me that to my face, the way you're telling me this?" Something flickered across Richard's expression, something that might have been respect, though he would not have called it that out loud. "I will," he said. "I owe you that much for walking up to this door the way you did." That's all I needed to hear. Marcus thought about the months of labor without wages, the winter ahead, the uncertainty of returning to find that none of it had mattered. He thought about Emily, and then he thought about the kind of man he wanted to be, regardless of whether Emily was part of the answer. "I'll leave tomorrow morning," Marcus said. Richard nodded once. There was no handshake, no additional words. The meeting was over. What Marcus did not know was that Emily had been awake since before he arrived. She had seen him coming up the road from her bedroom window, recognized his walk, and understood immediately why he had come. She had stood at the top of the stairs and listened through the gap in the door, not to spy, but because she knew her father, and she needed to understand what she was asking Marcus to walk into. When she heard the condition Richard had laid out, she did not go downstairs to argue. She did not run out after Marcus when she heard the front door close. She pressed her back against the wall and stared at the ceiling for a long time, turning it over in her mind. She knew her father well enough to understand that this was not cruelty. Richard Carter was not a man who destroyed things carelessly. Everything he built to last. And if he was testing Marcus this way without guarantees, without a safety net, it was because he believed on some level that Marcus could bear it. That belief was the closest thing to approval Emily had ever heard from him without him saying it outright. That evening, she knocked on her father's door. Richard was sitting at his desk going over a ledger. He looked up at her without pretending he didn't know what she was there for. "Are you going to keep your word?" Emily asked. Richard looked at her steadily. "I haven't given my word to anyone." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking if you're going to do the right thing." "And what do you think the right thing is?" "I think you already know what I believe about him. I think you sent him away for 12 miles because you needed to find out something about yourself, not just about Marcus." Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when someone had aimed too close to the truth. "You think you understand my reasons better than I do?" "No," Emily said. "I think I understand my own fear better than you do, because I've had to live with it longer than you've had to think about it. You get to test him from a distance, Papa. I have to sit in this house every single day not knowing if any of it matters." Richard did not answer her immediately. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and understood for the first time that she was not asking him to protect her. She was asking him to trust her. Those were not the same request, and he had spent 25 years confusing one for the other. He did not say anything more that night, but he closed his ledger, which was the closest thing to an answer he was prepared to give. Marcus left at first light the same way he had arrived, on foot, carrying one bag, wearing the same work clothes he had worn every other season of his life. The good shirt was folded back in his room. There was no reason to bring it where he was going. The Hale farm sat 12 miles east of town, and by the time Marcus reached it, the morning fog had not yet fully lifted. What he saw through that grey light was not encouraging. The fence along the front property line had collapsed in 2 places, the posts rotted through at the base. The barn roof was missing shingles on the eastern side, and the gap was wide enough that any serious snowfall would be a problem. 2 cattle stood in the near field, looking thin in the way animals look when they have been eating but not thriving, and a third was lying down in the mud near the water trough, which was not a good sign at that hour of the morning. Thomas Hale was standing near the barn door when Marcus came up the path. He was younger than Marcus had expected, not yet 30, with the kind of lean, uncertain frame that belonged to a man who had grown up doing lighter work than what he was now responsible for. He looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed suspicion with something closer to embarrassment. "Mr. Carter sent you," Thomas said. It was not quite a question. "He mentioned you might need an extra hand going into the winter," Marcus replied, setting his bag down without making a show of it. Thomas looked at the bag, then back at Marcus. "I don't need charity." "I'm not offering any," Marcus said. "I'm offering to work. Whether that's useful to you is your decision." Thomas did not say yes, but he did not say no either. He stepped aside from the barn door, which was close enough to an invitation. Marcus picked up his bag and went in. That first night, after the chores were finished and the light had gone, Thomas sat across from Marcus at a small table with 2 bowls of thin stew between them, and the silence between the 2 men was heavier than it needed to be. "You don't have to stay," Thomas said suddenly. "I know what this looks like. Some charity errand Carter sent your way to keep his conscience clean." Marcus set down his spoon. "You think that's what this is?" "I don't know what it is. I know I didn't ask for it." "No," Marcus agreed. "But your wife's going to have a baby in a house with a roof that won't hold snow, and your cattle are dying one at a time because nobody's told you the water's bad. You don't have to like why I'm here. You just have to let me fix what's broken before the cold finishes the job." Thomas didn't answer that night. But he didn't ask Marcus to leave either. The first 2 weeks were hard in a way that had nothing to do with the physical labor. Thomas was not an easy man to work alongside, not because he was unkind by nature, but because his pride was sitting very close to the surface of everything he did. He had inherited land he did not know how to manage from a father who had died too soon to teach him, and every day that something went wrong was another reminder of how unprepared he was. Marcus understood this without being told. He had worked alongside enough struggling men to recognize the ones who were angry at themselves but could only afford to show it sideways. So Marcus did not lecture. He did not offer opinions unless Thomas asked, and sometimes not even then. He simply worked methodically without complaint, starting before Thomas was up in the morning and finishing after the light had gone. He reset the fence posts along the front line. He patched the barn roof with timber he found stacked and forgotten behind the tool shed. He separated the sick cattle from the others, treated the water trough with clean lime, and adjusted the animal's feed until the one that had been lying down in the mud began to stand on its own again. Thomas watched all of this happening and said very little, but he began showing up earlier in the mornings. There was a morning in early November when Thomas finally broke his silence over something other than the work itself. He found Marcus mending a section of fence and stood there a while before speaking. "My father used to say a man who can't manage his own land doesn't deserve to call it his," Thomas said. "He used to say it like it was a fact, not an opinion. I've been thinking about that a lot since he died. Your father say a lot of things like facts that were really just fears wearing a hat," Marcus said, not unkindly. Thomas almost laughed. "You don't know anything about my father." "No, but I know plenty about men who say hard things to their sons because they're afraid of what happens if they say something soft instead." Marcus drove another nail into the post. "Don't let a dead man's fear decide whether you deserve what's yours." Thomas didn't say anything for a long moment, but something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, like a held breath finally let go. The crisis that changed things between them came on a night in late November when the temperature dropped sharply and Clara Hale went into early labor. She was 7 months along and had not been entirely well for the last several weeks, tired in a way that went beyond the ordinary tiredness of pregnancy, prone to headaches that kept her in the dim back bedroom for hours at a time. Thomas had been quietly terrified about the birth for longer than he had admitted to anyone. The nearest doctor was more than 2 hours away by horse, and the woman in town who served as a midwife had already told them to send for her early when the time came. The time came at 11 o'clock at night, without warning, in the middle of a cold that had ice forming on the inside of the window panes. Thomas came running out of the house and found Marcus in the barn checking on the cattle. The look on his face was enough. "It's too early," Thomas said, his voice cracking on the words. "It's too early, Marcus. Something's wrong. I can hear it in the way she's breathing." "Did you send for the midwife?" "There's no time. The roads. It's too cold. The horse won't make it there and back before." "Thomas." Marcus took him by both shoulders, steady, the way he might have steadied a spooked animal. "Look at me. You are going to ride for the midwife. Take the lantern. Take the heavy blanket off my bed. And you are going to ride like the weather doesn't exist. I will stay with Clara until you're back. Do you understand me?" Thomas nodded, his breath coming in short clouds in the freezing air. "Go!" Thomas ran for the horse. Marcus went into the house and found Clara in the back bedroom, pale and frightened, gripping the edge of the bed frame with both hands. "Where's Thomas?" she gasped. "Gone for the midwife. He'll be back soon as the roads allow." Marcus kept his voice even, deliberately calm, the way he had learned to speak to frightened animals and frightened men alike. "I need you to breathe with me, Clara. Just breathe." He built up the fire himself, boiled the water, found the clean linens in the cedar chest where Clara had told Thomas she had stored them weeks earlier in preparation. He kept his head clear and his hands steady, doing the things that needed doing, while outside the wind picked up and the minutes stretched longer than minutes had any right to stretch. An hour passed, then another quarter hour beyond that, with no sign of Thomas or the midwife, and Clara's pain coming faster now, closer together, her breathing turning ragged at the edges. Marcus felt the cold weight of a thought he did not want to have, that he might be the only person in that house when the baby came, whether he was ready for it or not. "Marcus," Clara said through gritted teeth, "if something happens to him out on that road—" "Nothing's happened to him. He's careful, and that horse knows this land better than the dark does." Marcus said it with more certainty than he felt, because certainty was the only thing he had to offer her in that moment, and a frightened woman in labor did not need his doubts added to her own. It was nearly midnight when he finally heard hooves outside, 2 sets moving fast. Thomas burst through the door with the midwife close behind him, both of them half frozen and breathless, and the relief on Thomas's face when he saw Clara still upright, still breathing, still fighting, was a thing Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. The midwife took over from there, her hands quick and certain. Thomas sent Marcus out to wait by the fire while he stayed with Clara. But the walls in that small house were thin, and neither man could pretend not to hear what was happening in the next room. The baby was small but came without complication, and when the crying started, it cut through the cold air of that house like something neither of the men had been ready for. Thomas came out of the room an hour later. His face looked like a man who had just been set down after being carried a very long distance. He did not say anything elaborate. He crossed the room and put his hand on Marcus's shoulder for a moment. One firm, wordless press, and then went back to his wife and his son. Marcus sat down in the chair by the fire and listened to the wind outside, and felt something settle in him that he hadn't realized was unsettled. After that night, the distance between the two men closed in a way that nothing else could have accomplished as efficiently. Thomas began asking Marcus questions, real questions, about soil composition and crop rotation, and how to read the signs of a hard winter in the behavior of animals. Marcus answered them without condescension, the way one working man speaks to another. By the time December had set in fully, they were rising at the same hour, eating at the same table, and working through problems together rather than in parallel. One evening by the fire, with the baby finally asleep and Clara resting, Thomas asked the question he'd clearly been holding for weeks. "Why are you really doing this, Marcus? A man doesn't give up a winter of his life for nothing." Marcus considered the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because Richard Carter's daughter is the reason I'm standing in your barn instead of sitting somewhere warm, and because the only way he'll let me marry her is if I prove I'm the kind of man who doesn't need a reason to do right by a stranger." Thomas absorbed that in silence. "And if he says no anyway, after all this? Then I go home knowing I did something worth doing regardless. That's not nothing, Thomas. Some men go their whole lives without knowing that much about themselves." Thomas looked at him for a long time after that, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity, but a kind of respect that hadn't existed in their first weeks together. "You're a better man than most I've known," he said quietly. "I hope Carter has the sense to see it." What neither of them knew was that Richard Carter had been making quiet inquiries the entire time. He did not travel to the Hale farm himself. Instead, he asked the questions that a man in his position was able to ask without drawing attention. A word with the merchant who delivered dry goods to that part of the county. A conversation with the minister whose congregation included several families in that area. A casual exchange with a man who had passed through and stopped at the Hale property to ask directions. Every account he received described the same person. A man who worked without being watched. A man who fixed what was broken without waiting to be told. A man who had stayed through the worst of the cold without any guarantee that it meant anything for his own life. There was one account, though, that nearly unraveled everything before it had a chance to finish playing out. In early December, a man named Garrett Boyd, who ran a smaller farm bordering Carter's land, and who had long resented Richard's fair treatment of his black hired hands as some kind of personal insult, caught wind of why Marcus had really gone east. Boyd was the sort of man who collected grievances the way other men collected debts, and he saw in this situation an opportunity to settle several at once. He rode out to the county seat and spoke to anyone who would listen, framing the arrangement in the ugliest terms he could manage. That Carter was selling his daughter's hand for free labor, that Marcus was no different than any opportunist looking to climb above his station, that the whole arrangement was an insult to decent people on both sides of it. The talk spread fast, the way ugly talk always spreads faster than the truth that might correct it. Richard heard about it from his foreman, a steady man named Hollis, who had worked the Carter land for over a decade and didn't waste words. "Boyd's been running his mouth in town," Hollis said, "saying things about you and the girl and the man you sent east. People are starting to ask questions you might not want asked." Richard's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. "Let them ask. Some of them aren't just asking, Mr. Carter. Boyd's the kind who likes to turn talk into trouble when talk alone doesn't satisfy him." "I know what kind of man Garrett Boyd is," Richard said. "I knew it before you told me, and I'll know it after. If he wants to make this his business, he can come and say so to my face. Until then, I won't waste my breath on a man who needs an audience to feel brave." But privately, alone that night, Richard sat at his desk longer than usual, the ledger open in front of him, unread. He thought about what it would mean if the talk grew loud enough to reach Emily directly, to reach Marcus out on the Hale farm where he had no way to defend himself against it. He thought, too, about whether his own resolve would hold if the cost of this decision stopped being private and started being public in a way that could not be ignored. He did not share any of this with Emily. But she could read her father well enough to know that something had shifted in him in the subtle way that his manner changed when he had resolved something privately. He was quieter at dinner. He spent more time in the evenings sitting on the porch rather than going over his ledgers. He looked out across his own land the way a man does when he is calculating something that has nothing to do with crops. Emily kept herself occupied. She took on the management of the Carter farm's accounts during that winter, work she had always shared with her father but now handled almost entirely on her own. She repaired the chicken coop after a windstorm brought down one of its walls. She drove herself into town for supplies on mornings when the roads were bad enough that Richard had suggested she wait. It was on one of those trips into town that she first heard Garrett Boyd's version of events, secondhand, from a shopkeeper who didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care, that he was repeating it directly to the woman at the center of it. Emily stood very still at the counter and let him finish, her face giving away nothing, though her hands had gone cold around the coins she was counting out. She did not confront the man. She did not run home in tears. She finished her purchase, thanked him with perfect civility, and walked back to the wagon with her spine straight the entire way. It was only once she was alone on the road home that she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd heard, not because she believed a word of it, but because she understood with sudden and total clarity exactly how much this would cost both her and Marcus if her father's resolve ever wavered under that kind of pressure. That night she did not go to her father's door. Instead, she wrote a letter she never sent, addressed to no one, simply to get the fear out of her own chest and onto paper where she could look at it and decide whether it deserved to stay. By the time she finished writing, she had decided it didn't. She was not performing capabilities she had always had. She was reminding herself of them, building herself up against the uncertainty of waiting for something she had no control over. There were evenings when she sat by the window after the house had gone dark and looked out at nothing in particular, thinking about Marcus somewhere out there in the cold, working a stranger's land for nothing, while a man like Garrett Boyd spent his evenings warm by a fire, trying to tear down something he had no part in building. She did not allow herself to fall into feeling sorry for either of them. What she felt instead was something closer to a hard, clear ache, the kind that does not ask to be soothed, only acknowledged. She had made no promises to Marcus, and he had made none to her. But they both knew what was true, and knowing something true is its own kind of commitment. By the time March arrived, the Hale farm had survived its worst season. The cattle were healthy. The barn was sound. Thomas had planted a modest winter crop that was holding, and he had already begun making plans for spring with a steadiness in his voice that had been entirely absent when Marcus arrived. Clara was well, and the baby, a boy they had named after Thomas's father, had filled out from the fragile, early-arrived thing he had been into something considerably more robust. On the morning Marcus packed his bag to leave, Thomas came out and stood beside him in the yard. He pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket and held it out. "At least take this," he said. "You've earned more than what's in there, but it's what I have." Marcus looked at the envelope for a moment, then shook his head. "Keep it for the boy," he said. "He's going to need new boots before you know it." Thomas put the envelope back in his pocket. He looked at Marcus the way a man looks at someone he will not forget. "I don't know what you're going home to," Thomas said carefully, "but I hope it's something good." "So do I," Marcus said, and there was a rare honesty in his voice that surprised even himself. "For what it's worth," Thomas added, "if Carter has any sense left in him after everything he's put you through, he'll see what the rest of us already do." Marcus picked up his bag and started down the road. He did not say what he was going home to. He was not entirely sure himself. The walk back was longer than he remembered. Or maybe it just felt that way because each mile brought him closer to a door he was not certain would open for him, and because somewhere on that road he found himself thinking about Garrett Boyd's name, which Thomas had mentioned in passing without realizing what it might mean. A rumor circulating through the county that Marcus had never heard, about talk and trouble brewing in his absence. He did not know the details. He only knew, with a kind of cold certainty settling into his chest, that whatever waited for him at the Carter house might not be as simple as Richard's word alone. He had done everything Richard had asked. He had done it without expectation, without performance, without an audience. He had done it because it was the right thing, and because he was the kind of man who could not do otherwise. But none of that guaranteed him anything, and he knew it. Richard Carter had made that clear from the beginning, and Marcus had agreed to those terms with his eyes open. Now he had to live inside those terms, which was a different matter entirely from agreeing to them. He reached the Carter farm in the late afternoon when the light was going orange across the fields. He stood at the gate for a while, looking at the house, watching the lamp come on in the front room as the sun went down. There was a tightness in his chest that hadn't been there on the walk out months ago. Then, he had only had hope to lose. Now he had months of cold, months of work, months of a stranger's gratitude weighing on him, and he understood that losing this would cost him more than it would have before. Then he walked up to the door, knocked, and waited. Upstairs, Emily had heard his knock. She had been listening for it without admitting to herself that she was listening. And when it came, she moved quietly to the top of the stairs and stood there in the shadows, the same way she had stood months ago when he had first come to this house. She could hear everything from there, every word, every breath of silence between words. She did not go down, not yet. She needed to hear what her father would say when there was no one watching him either. Richard opened the door himself, the same as he had the first time. He looked at Marcus standing there in the fading light, the worn boots, the same travel bag, the face of a man who had been through a full winter and come out the other side without complaint, and he stepped back from the door without a word. Marcus came inside. The front room looked exactly as it had the morning Marcus had sat across from Richard and made his case. The same plain furniture. Richard poured 2 cups of water from the same pitcher and set one in front of Marcus the same as before. Marcus recognized the gesture for what it was, not repetition, but continuity. Richard was saying without words that he had not forgotten where they had left off and that everything in between still mattered. "I heard you came back without taking any pay," Richard said. Marcus wrapped both hands around the cup. "Thomas offered. I told him to keep it for the baby." Richard nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is confirming something he already knew rather than learning it for the first time. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Marcus with that same unhurried attention he had given him at the very beginning, the look that had always felt less like judgment and more like reading. "I also heard something else while you were gone," Richard said. "Talk in town. Garrett Boyd's been saying things. About me, about you, about Emily. The kind of things men say when they want to feel powerful over something that isn't theirs to comment on." Marcus's hand tightened slightly around the cup, but his voice stayed even. "I haven't heard any of it." "No reason you should have. It was never your burden to carry, and I made sure of that. But I want you to know it happened, because I want you to understand what I'm about to say next isn't happening in some quiet corner where it costs me nothing." Richard set down his own cup. "There will be people in this county who say worse before this is finished. I've made my peace with that. I need to know you have too. Because what comes next will land on you harder than it lands on me." "I made my peace with that the morning I walked up your road the first time, Mr. Carter," Marcus said. "Whatever they say, I've already decided it won't be the thing that decides who I am." Something in Richard's face eased, just slightly. "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other." "I've been asking around about you," Richard continued. "Not just from Thomas, from people who've worked alongside you over the years, people who had no reason to tell me anything but the truth." He let that settle before continuing. "Every one of them said the same thing in different words, that you do what you say you'll do, that you don't ask for more than you've earned, that you've never once, as far as anyone can remember, walked away from something because it got hard." Marcus did not respond. He had not come back to argue his own case. He had come back because he had said he would, and because whatever Richard decided, Marcus needed to hear it in person. "I want to tell you something," Richard said, and his voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but less formal, the way a man sounds when he stops speaking as a figure of authority and starts speaking as himself. "The test I gave you was never about whether you could save a farm. Any competent man with experience could have done what I asked. What I needed to know was what you would do when there was nothing in it for you, no wages, no guarantee, no promise waiting at the end. Because that's the only situation in which a man cannot pretend to be better than he is." Marcus looked at him steadily across the table. "I also needed to know something about myself," Richard continued. "Whether I was the kind of man who could do right by his daughter even when doing right was going to cost something. There are people in this county who will not understand what I'm about to say. There are people who will make their feelings known in ways that are less than pleasant. I have thought about that every day since you walked out of this house in the fall. Richard set down his cup and looked directly at Marcus. I have thought about it, and I have made my peace with it. The room was quiet. Outside, the last of the evening light was giving out, and the lamp on the table held the only warmth in the space between them. You can marry my daughter, Richard said. The words were plain and without ceremony, delivered in the same tone Richard Carter used to discuss crop yields and fence repair. But Marcus felt them the way you feel the ground after a long time not being sure it will hold. He did not smile immediately. He sat with it for a moment, breathing, letting it be real. Thank you, Marcus said. I won't forget what this cost you. See that you don't, Richard replied. But the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was as close to warmth as his face generally allowed. At the top of the stairs, Emily had heard every word. When she heard her father say those 4 words, "You can marry my daughter," she pressed both hands flat against the wall beside her and closed her eyes. She stood there for a long moment, not moving, letting it settle through her the way rain settles into dry ground, completely and all at once. Then she drew a slow breath, opened her eyes, and walked downstairs. She came into the room without hurrying, and when Marcus looked up and saw her, he stood from his chair the way a man stands when something matters enough to require it. Emily looked at him, the worn clothes, the tired eyes, the quiet steadiness that had never once wavered in all the time she had known him, and she crossed the room and took his hand in both of hers without saying anything at all. There was nothing that needed to be said that the gesture did not already contain. You heard, Marcus said quietly. All of it, Emily said. Every word, from the first morning to this one. And? Emily looked at her father, then back at Marcus, her eyes bright with something she was not trying very hard to hide. And I think you should know. I never doubted what the answer would be. Not because I trusted my father's mercy, but because I trusted you to give him no honest reason to say no. Richard, watching from across the room, allowed himself something that, on a less guarded man, might have been called a smile. He understood in that moment what he had really been protecting all along. Not Emily from the world, not the family name from gossip. He had been protecting the possibility that his daughter would end up with someone who deserved her. And that was a different thing entirely from the reasons most fathers gave for the decisions they made. In the weeks that followed, Garrett Boyd's talk did not simply vanish, the way talk rarely does when a man has invested his pride in it. He tried once, in town, to bait Richard publicly outside the feed store, suggesting loudly enough for a small crowd to hear that Richard had disgraced his family name for the sake of free farm labor. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not so much as quicken his pace. He simply stopped, turned, and looked at Boyd with the same calm, unhurried attention he gave to everything else in his life that required taking seriously. Garrett, Richard said, you've spent more breath on my family's business this winter than you've spent managing your own land, and from what I hear, your land could use the attention. A few onlookers laughed, not unkindly, but enough to take the air out of Boyd's posture. When you've got something worth saying about a man's character, say it to his face. Otherwise, I'd be obliged if you kept my daughter's name out of your mouth. Boyd had no answer for that, and the crowd's laughter did more to settle the matter than any argument could have. The talk did not disappear entirely. Talk like that rarely does. But it lost its teeth, the way most cruelty does when it's met without flinching. Richard did not give Marcus money or land or any of the material things that a more conventional arrangement might have provided. What he offered instead was a proposition. Marcus would take on a managing role at the Carter farm, responsible for a portion of the operations, compensated at a fair wage for every hour of every day he worked. It was not charity. It was not a gift. It was the same offer Richard would have made to any man he trusted to help run what he had spent his life building. And the fact that he was making it to Marcus was itself a statement, even if Richard did not frame it as one. Marcus accepted without negotiating the terms, because the terms were fair, and he knew it. The wedding took place in the spring, on a Saturday morning when the fields were beginning to show green again after the long winter. It was a small gathering, a minister, a handful of people who had known Emily since she was a child, and Thomas Hale, who had driven the 12 miles himself with Clara and the baby to be there. Some of the neighbors who might have come did not. Some who came did not come again afterward. The county had its opinions, and the county expressed them in the familiar ways that communities express disapproval, through silence and distance, and the withdrawal of small social courtesies that most people do not notice until they are gone. Marcus and Emily noticed. They chose not to be diminished by it. There is a difference between ignoring a thing and refusing to let it define you, and they had both learned that difference long before they stood beside each other in front of a minister on a spring morning. Richard stood at the edge of the gathering and watched his daughter become a married woman, with the face of a man who had arrived at a decision through a long road and was no longer second-guessing the journey. When Thomas Hale shook his hand afterward and said simply, "You did right by him," Richard accepted the words without deflecting them, which was about as close as he ever came to receiving a compliment gracefully. The years that followed were not without difficulty. They never are for anyone. And the particular difficulties that came with being Marcus and Emily Williams in the American South at the turn of the century were not insignificant. But the farm ran well. Marcus was good at the work and better at the management, and the men who worked under him, men of both races, paid equally for equal labor in the same tradition Richard had established, tended to stay because they knew they would be treated fairly. That reputation spread in the quiet way that honest reputations spread, and after a few years, the Carter-Williams farm was known throughout the county, not as the place where a black man had married a white woman, but as the place where a man's work was worth something. Richard grew older in the way of men who have spent their lives outdoors, slower in the body, but no less sharp in the mind. He had a habit in his later years of sitting on the porch in the evenings and watching Marcus walk the far edge of the property before supper, checking the fence line or the condition of the soil or whatever needed checking that day. He had wanted a son once, the kind of wanting that a man stops admitting to himself because it seems too late to matter. He found in those evenings on the porch that he had gotten what he had wanted, not through the accident of biology, but through a series of choices that each could have gone differently, and had not. One evening, with the grandchildren's laughter drifting from somewhere near the barn, Richard said to Marcus, without any particular ceremony, "I never told you what it cost me, sending you out to that farm, watching you walk down that road not knowing if I'd keep my word." "You didn't have to tell me," Marcus said. "I figured it cost you something, or you wouldn't have asked it of me in the first place." "It cost me sleep," Richard admitted. "It cost me a few friendships I didn't much miss in the end. But it never once cost me a doubt about whether it was the right thing to do. I want you to know that. Whatever else this county thought of the decision, I never doubted it for a single night." Marcus looked at the older man for a long moment. "That's worth more to me than you probably know, Mr. Carter." Richard said, "I think we're long past Mr. Carter." Emily understood her father better in those years than she ever had before. She understood that his condition on the day Marcus had come to ask for her hand had not been an obstacle. It had been an act of love, the most honest one he knew how to perform. He could not simply believe a man was good because the man said so. He needed to create the conditions under which goodness either appeared or it did not. And once he had seen it appear under circumstances that offered nothing in return, he had been ready to give everything he had. Marcus never became wealthy by the measure that the world around him preferred to use. But he owned a portion of the land he worked. He had a house that belonged to him and the woman beside him. He had children who would grow up knowing their father's name meant something in the county he had chosen to call home. And every morning, when he rose before the sun to begin the work that was now his own, he met the day as a man who had never asked for more than a fair chance and had built everything he needed from the moment one was finally given. A good man can always build towards something, but no amount of something has ever built a good man. That was the truth Richard Carter had known when he sat across from Marcus Williams at that plain table with 2 cups of water between them. It was the truth he had staked his daughter's future on, and it was the truth that held subscribe for more stories about dignity and doing the right thing.